Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Sorry about the notebook. I prepared it, not quite as in advance as I should have, and I've got a bad memory being, quite old. So, my name's Aidan. I'm 34, and I'm from the West Midlands area, from Walsall. Don't know if anyone else is from that way. Yeah, okay. And basically, I reverted in 2015, so at the age of 31, so quite a late comer compared to some of the other guys that have spoken. I'm going to keep this quite real and quite truthful, so it's not my intention, but if I do offend anybody or upset somebody, please forgive me in advance for that. It wouldn't make sense to talk about how I reverted to Islam if I didn't give you a bit of an underpinning background to my family situation and how I grew up. Basically, I grew up in a non-practicing Christian family, and the same for school. So at school, we sang hymns, Kumbaya, he's got the whole world in his hands, all these things, and They told us religious stories, but not stories that I could relate to at that age. So, stories about Jesus feeding a whole community from fish. At that age, all I thought was, you best not give me any fish. I hate fish. And that kind of thing. Stories based on Jesus, I never took it on board. And it just seemed like there were stories with no meaning. My family didn't go to church. The only time we ended up at church was for a family wedding or a funeral, which was once in a blue moon, My family are actually very simple people. They're working class and very hard-working. My mum's worked in care for 40 plus years, and my dad works on trams, in the Birmingham area. They're really generous and nice people. But they've never bothered with faith. And they never had actually an interest in their education either. They didn't guide me when I was younger. When I was at school, I was quite a bright lad, but I was quite naughty. In fact, I was very naughty. But I remember one time on my last exam, before I gave school up, my last GCSE exam, I thought it was a good idea to smash the fire alarm. And everybody else that was in school, 2,000 pupils, ended up going to the tennis courts, the gated tennis courts, which were, where they took the roll call. And me and my friends thought it'd be an even better idea to padlock everybody inside the tennis courts. So that was my last day at school. I won't talk about the previous days before that. Apart from a few years ago, my mum actually found out that I'm not actually in my school year photo. I was drunk and I was getting high on my friend's mother's medication. So that was a good start for me. Okay, so I left school with a few GCSEs, a couple of B's and C's, nothing groundbreaking. I didn't even know what A-levels were, especially I didn't have a clue what sixth form was. I just thought it was a place where keen people went to kind of avoid work. So my dad drove me around every local factory in the industrial estate and told me to go and ask for work. And I actually ended up when I was 16, making glasses lenses for prisoners. They, would do work in the prisons and they needed certain prescription lenses for their work. I got fed up with that and I decided that I wanted more from life, and I joined the army at 16 years old. And I went to Iraq when I was 18 years old in 2003. And up until this point, I hadn't, I'd gone all my life and most of my time in the army without giving religion a single thought. Schools, they aren't like they are nowadays. They're not very, the schools that I attended weren't very multicultural. And even if there was multicultural elements, they weren't embraced as they are now. Religious education basically consisted of learning about Christianity in really non-spiritual ways, such as textbooks, copying off the board, things that you can't really relate to. And Judaism and Hindu and Sikhism, Buddhism were mentioned, but barely scratched the surface. And I can't remember talking about Islam at all at school. The only thing I do remember being interested in was the idea of reincarnation. I don't know if you remember that from school, or basically it's where you live a certain way of life, and if you live a good life, then you come back as a good creature. If you live a bad life, then you might come back as a cockroach or an ant or something similar. And I thought maybe I should live a bit of a bad life and demote myself a little bit, so that maybe I could come back as a lion and eat all the RE teachers. That was my mentality at that age. Okay. So going back to my time in Iraq, 9/11 had occurred. I was a young lad. I spent a lot of time in Iraq wearing a thick protective suit, a gas mask, sleeping in trenches that we had dug in the stone. And then daily we were bombarded by Scud missiles, and we basically were living in a very fearful time. Good old Tony Blair sold me the idea that we were going there to help others and protect them from weapons of mass destruction. But when the war was over and I was getting ready to go home, I actually had a chance to read some of the newspapers from the UK, and that's when I realised that there was a lot of political arguments around the Iraq war, and it was for oil. It was basically for oil. And upon realising this, my heart sank. I felt sick, and I felt used and very misled. I came back home to my family, and I was given a hero's welcome. Balloons on the outside of the house, cakes and hugs and things, but I didn't feel like a hero at that time at all. It was this point that I started to notice certain trends in my family's behaviour. Okay. Don't get me wrong, my family are wonderful people, they're caring, but they're just very ignorant and stuck behind the times with equality and things like that. There's been a guy who worked in the corner shop for 30 plus years now. His name's Pete Singh, I think he changed his first name. And he's a lovely guy. He's served the local area for years and years, and my dad will still say to me, Aidan, here's £10, go and get me some lagers from the packy shop. I'm like, Dad, like Mrs. Kaur has a bindi, she's Indian, and he's like, oh, they're all the same, and it's this sort of behaviour that, although he doesn't mean to be that way, that's what they are, that's how they've lived their lives, and that's all they know. Okay. So one time I was driving my dad to work in some of my time off, and we were running a bit late, and we got to a pedestrian crossing, and there was an old elderly Asian man crossing the road, and that time my dad turned around to me and says, maybe you should run him over. I said, what? He said, well, I'm sick of all these people, they're everywhere now. He said, if you put your foot down, we can get to work quicker. And that's when I realised that the whole kind of way I was brought up was the wrong kind of idea. We shouldn't be thinking that way at all. And that's when I started to distance myself from that kind of mentality. I worked a few shifts in the BP garage with some Muslims, just to help out, control the pumps, sell a few things in the shop. And I lived in a small town called Aldridge, and white people used to come in and they'd say, hi, hello, and then they'd turn around to me when it was quiet and they'd say, it's nice to see a white face in here for a change. And that really struck me as something that wasn't very kind or nice at all. Okay, so in 2006 I got married, and I had two beautiful children following that. During the first pregnancy, I was sent to Afghanistan. But before I went to Afghanistan, I thought that if I'm going over there to fight Muslims, essentially, for Queen and country, then it's best that I prepare myself. And I listened to an audiobook of the Quran. My intention, I'll be honest, was to give myself an understanding of how Muslims think and act, and that if I had this information, it would give me a better chance, an advantage of surviving my time over there. So my intention was to get to know my enemy, How do they think? How do they act, and what morals do they live by? Trying to get an insight and find any weaknesses to use to my advantage. I thought what was going to happen and what I was going to hear in the audiobook was going to be all about hate and killings and rape and disgusting things. When I actually sat down and listened to the audiobook, I found that all I heard was about peace and good ways to live a decent life and being kind to others. The content of it I thought was amazing, but obviously with a new marriage occurring, I got pulled away from that realisation, and I was sent to Afghanistan, to fight there. So I put all these thoughts to the back of my mind, and I went away and did a couple of tours. Not long after that, I left the army and I got divorced. I started working in a multicultural school as a safeguarding officer, so I dealt with medical conditions, first aid, accidents, self-harming children, and it was very multicultural, very deprived. And one time, it was Ramadan 2015, and a young girl came into my office. She was being held, propped up by other pupils, and it was 30 degrees outside. And I sat her down. She was fasting. She was only 12 years old, and so I gave her an ice pack, and she came round after a few minutes. And I said, look, I said, you've not eaten all day. You've not drank a single thing. You look like you've hardly slept. You're outside in 30 degrees, okay, and you're 12 years old, and you're putting yourself through physical activity, and you come to me feeling ill. I said, why are you doing this to yourself? And she said, sir, I'm doing this because I want to be closer to God. I want good things for me and my family, And basically I said to her, but look, it's 30 degrees outside. How can you handle that heat when you've not even had a drink? And she said, sir, don't worry about me. She says, it doesn't matter how hot it is outside. That's nothing compared to hell. And I thought to myself, here's this 12-year-old girl giving me a lecture on life. And that point triggered me to start Googling all about Islam. And I started, basic Google searches, and I started to watch videos by a guy called Abdul Rahim Green. I don't know if you've heard of him. He was somebody that I could connect to, and there was a certain video called Sex, Drugs and Rock and Roll. If anyone's ever seen that video, it's very, very good video. And I felt an instant connection with the works that he was doing. I thought to myself, it's now or never. Basically, every idea that I ever had of God within myself and in my own head was literally being put in front of me on a plate, to the letter, perfectly, and I couldn't fault any of it. Basically, at that time in my life, I was 31 years old. I wasn't very successful, and I started to look at what Islam portrays as successful. And I found that it wasn't being wealthy, it wasn't having status or power, and it wasn't doing a degree. It was by your belief in God, how pious you are, and how well you treat other people and other creatures. And I believed I still had that in me. At the time, I was being a bad person. I was drinking, I was sleeping around, I would Facebook 5, 6, 7 different females. I would talk to them, and if I didn't get what I wanted from one of them, I'd drop them like liquid, and I'd move on to the next. And I actually had somebody that I was getting to know come fly over from Australia, and they came to see me in London, and basically I started to think about my children, and I knew that what I was doing was bad. This is a picture of my children, and this is who I were basically neglecting at that time. My family, my parents, my friends. I wasn't behaving well at all, and I knew that I needed to change. So I decided to take my Shahada. Okay. Now, I've never been to a mosque in my life. I had no idea what goes on in a mosque. But I took the bus and I went down to Green Lane. Has anyone been to Green Lane Masjid in Birmingham? Okay, this mosque to me at the time, it looked bigger than Warwick Castle. It was huge, big massive wooden doors, old building. And so I went up to this big wooden door and I give it a big thud. Didn't know what I was going to say. And then I heard these massive pounding footsteps coming down the stairs. And door swings open and there's the tallest, the widest guy in a thobe that I've ever seen. He's massive. His name's Abu Isa.
What was his name?
Abu Isa.
Abu Isa.
Okay. And his beard's longer than I'm tall. And I stand there and he says, "Can I help?" And I'm like, "My name's Aidan, I think I want to be a Muslim." And at this time I've got thoughts going through my head. He might, I'm going to have to tell him that I'm an ex-soldier. He's going to take me up to the room, he's going to chop off my head and put it on. This is all genuine feelings and fears that I went through at that time. I felt alone, but at the same time he just laughed at me and he says, "Come upstairs, come on." And he took me under his wing. He spoke to me for about an hour. He questioned me about my beliefs and my knowledge, and he says, "Brother, I think you're ready." And there and then, he says, "I don't need to wait." I repeated the words, "La ilaha illallah, Muhammadun Rasulullah." There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is the messenger of Allah. And the people in the room at the time all gave me a hug and made me feel very, very good about everything that I'd just undertook. I went back a couple of times and he showed me how to pray. He showed me how to do wudu and all the basics. He gave me a good introduction to Islam. And then after that, a few days later, I went on a revert retreat where Abdul Rahim Green was giving lectures, and that was a good insight as well. Don't worry, I'm nearly done now. Okay, so I noticed a change in my perspective on the world within a few weeks of coming to Islam. I was very nationalistic, patriotic, Queen and country, let's protect our borders, stop the immigrants, save us from the refugees, all of these really warped ideas of nationalism, basically. And so all the values that I valued in life changed, and the way that I thought about everybody was that now everybody deserves to be treated with humanity. We've got enough resources to share and to provide everybody in the world to live safely and secure within our means, and Allah provides. I had a change of heart and I decided to become a doctor. I felt that I've still got 35 years left in me to do something good for people. So I decided to go to night school, redo all of my education from scratch, and I found myself in med school this year. My family initially were hostile to the changes in me. My first Ramadan, a lot of Muslims paid me lip service. They says, "Oh, I'll invite you over, we'll share a meal, this, that and the other." And then I found during Ramadan I was very much alone and people weren't replying to my messages. My family, every time I prayed, they would open my room, and sometimes my niece, who was living with me at the time, would open my door and laugh at me with her school friends, while I was praying. My family owned dogs, and I only had one place where I could pray, a very small area, and they used to lock the dogs in my room so that when I came back from work, when I intended to pray, there'd just be dog mess in the only place that I could pray. I'm not perfect. I'm still trying to learn and live a kind life. As soon as I came to Islam, I stopped eating pork. My dad's fridge used to be full of pork, sausages, bacon, pizza with pepperoni, you name it, it's there, and it's a big part of the diet. It took me some time to start eating halal, so I actually became vegetarian for a long time until I could source good sources of halal food. So I guess there's a lesson that I want to portray, that I guess we can all do better. We can all change no matter how small, and we all have things to learn about ourselves. And just to conclude, please don't try and track down any member of my family for what I've just disclosed and, give them a shoe-in or something. As of last Christmas, I gave my dad a Quran, and he's promised me that he's going to read it, and he was sincere. And after talking to my aunt about Islam, she's very drawn into it, but at the moment she's scared to change religion because she lost a little boy when he was very little, and she's scared that if she changes religion, then she might miss her opportunity to be with him in Jannah. So that's just some of the kind of viewpoints of English Christian people and why they're scared to change sometimes. Thank you very much.
Good to stay.